it's very hard to characterize operas of the last 10 or 15 years with one handy generalization. You know, they are so various amongst themselves, both in subject matter and technique, that it's very hard to give a generalization about them. I could maybe just point to a few interesting examples of different ways of approaching the genre over the last 10 or 15 years, which have struck me. Having said that, maybe one generalization one could make is that on the whole, operas avoid historical themes and historical texts. But I could immediately mention a couple of striking exceptions to that rule. One is The Tempest of Thomas Adès, which of course takes its theme from the famous play of Shakespeare, although it's not actually based on Shakespeare's text. It was written to a newly composed libretto, deliberately un-Shakespearean libretto by Meredith Oakes, although the narrative of the opera sticks fairly closely to it. That's notable for being the exception to the rule, I guess. There are one or two others I can think of, such as Julian Anderson's opera based on the Orestein trilogy with a new libretto by Frank McGuinness. So two exceptions. Those aside, operas on the whole work with new themes, new texts, new writers. Perhaps another thing that could be said is that they do not obey any sort of distinction between high themes and low, and one is as likely to find a low-life character at the center of an opera these days as a noble character. I mean, one can find occasionally distinctly noble characters, you know, who wrestle with big moral dilemmas. For example, Dr. Oppenheimer in John Adams's opera Dr. Atomic, who is indeed wrestling with big moral dilemmas about his work creating the first atom bomb. And that moral dilemma informs the subject of his big aria. You know, it's that opera is well known for having a big lyrical aria in the old sense, and the moral dilemma is the heart of that aria. And that's a sudden reminder, really, that of an old-fashioned category, you know, of the lyrical outpouring devoted to a dilemma, you know, as one might find in Verdi almost. But more common, I suppose, are those operas where the leading characters are not noble. They're often, emphatically ordinary. A good example of someone who's not just ordinary, but downright trashy, I suppose, is Anna Nicole, the reality TV star, American, who was a big, well-known figure in America for some years after she appeared on a reality TV show, but then died an early death because she succumbed to the celebrity lifestyle. And she was the subject matter of Mark Anthony Turnage's opera Anna Nicole, which traced her rise and fall with a sympathetic eye, I must say. But it was striking that the production style of that opera, which scandalized many people, I have to say, was inspired, if that's the word, by the look of reality TV shows. So the look of the production was exceedingly shiny and a sort of glittery trash, if I can put it that way. And the musical idiom called partly on what you might call MOR pop, middle of the road pop, but also called on the composer Mark Anthony Turnage's familiar idiom of a sort of melancholy blues-like flavor. So although the leading character in that opera is of low life, she's not treated in an unsympathetic low way. Then there are those operas which are inspired or modeled on films, movies, which is a kind of flourishing subgenre, I suppose, in opera. Two examples come to mind. One by Olga Neuwirth is based on David Lynch's film Lost Highway, and when the production came to London, I was very struck by the way the visual language of David Lynch's movies had really infiltrated the production style. It was as if we were looking at a Lynch movie projected into 3D, as it were. You know, that way he creates an uncanny sense of the mystery and the sinister menace lurking under the appearance of ordinariness that you find in American city suburbs. It was really very well recreated. Also, another feature of that production was the way film itself was brought into the production. So often one saw simultaneous planes of action with a sung acted scene happening on one level of the staging in front of us, while up above on another level another part of the narrative was being told in video terms. Occasionally one even saw the same character appearing twice, once live on the stage below and another time above on the screen. Another example of an opera based on a pre-existing film is Thomas Addis's most recent opera, The Exterminating Angel, based on the film of the same name by Louis Buñuel. It's one of his later films from the 1970s, I think, which describes the fate of a group of people who are invited to a dinner party and find themselves at the end mysteriously unable to leave the scene of the gathering. It's as if they are trapped permanently inside this space, and the film portrays their gradual disintegration, which proved to be interestingly suitable for transference to an opera. The move to the operatic medium allows us to perhaps gain a deeper insight into each individual character than perhaps was possible in the movie. My sense is that these new forms of opera have attracted their own audience. There is some crossover in the big houses. I remember at the first night of Mark Anthony Turnage's Anna Nicole that the audience was interestingly mixed. One could spot the composer's fans amongst the audience. I could even see some of them, knew some of them personally, but they were distinguished by the fact they were on the whole younger and looked different. But I could also see that a regular part of the English National Opera's normal audience was also there, including the then chairman, who I think was looked ashen and shocked afterwards that something quite so vulgar had been seen on the beloved stage of the English National Opera. So I think some parts of the audience were certainly, rather scandalized. Outside the big houses, I think it's a different audience. Partly because the spaces themselves are different. One sees these new operas in places like the experimental studio of Covent Garden, which very definitely has its own audience. You see it in often theatre spaces rather than specifically operatic spaces, like Battersea Arts Centre, for example, or the Riverside Studios in Hammersmith. These are the kind of spaces where one often sees these new operas, and there I think it's often a contemporary theatre audience that one sees there. For example, one of the most striking operas, new operas of recent years, is by Philip Venables. It's entitled 4.48 Psychosis. That's the title. And it's a setting of the last play by a very remarkable young female playwright called Sarah Kane. It was the last play she wrote before she committed suicide. And it's a very bitter, but also rather beautiful meditation on the nature of clinical depression. So, you know, there's an example of a theme that one doesn't normally find treated in opera, with merciless, you know, forensic detail. And I remember the audience there for the opening night, which was in the Lyric Theatre in Hammersmith, was mostly the audience that you find in that theatre for other productions. It wasn't really an opera audience at all, because the subject and the playwright was already known to that audience. So yeah, I think a short answer would be that I think these new forms of contemporary opera are drawing mostly their own audiences. I suppose on a wider level, this choice of subjects, this choice of venues, leads composers towards an idiom of greater realism, I suppose, and one sees there's a general reduction, I suppose, in what one might call lyrical effusiveness, and also in set forms. You know, arias and duets are in short supply in the old sense in these new operas, except, I have to say, in those operas which deliberately cultivate a kind of ironic invocation of those old forms to create effectively comedy or pathos. There was a rather good, I thought, new opera, The Lost Hotel, the first opera by the Irish composer Donnacha Dennehy, which explores the relationships between three people who arrive at a mysteriously remote hotel simultaneously. And one discovers that they've, by accident as it were, and one discovers that the three of them have an interesting past together, which is gradually revealed through the course of the opera, which of course is revealed in solos, arias and duets, and also the occasional ensemble for all three. So the kind of formal structures of opera as traditionally understood can sometimes be useful to composers now. New operas aren't necessarily composed in a sort of realistic song speech idiom. One can find, you know, a revival of what you might call number opera. One opera where this is done in a very amusing way is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, one of the several operas by another Irish composer, Gerald Barry, which sets Lewis Carroll's famous children's stories in a rather literal way. Actually, a lot of the original text is used, and this is full of witty evocations of old operatic categories, in particular the virtuoso coloratura soprano aria. In fact, the entire opera is a kind of absurdly exaggerated feast of vocal virtuosity, which Barry uses to exaggerate the surreal absurdity of the characters. So one does see an extraordinary variety of vocal modes of vocality, you know, all the way from barely musicalized speech, all the way through to the most outrageously extravagant virtuosity. As far as coping with the pandemic in a creative way goes, there has been the most extraordinary response of musicians of all kinds to the closing of public spaces. they have refused to disappear. Instead, they have moved their activities, in many cases, online. There has been an incredible profusion of online performance at all scales, from the individual musician in their living room, right up to the Berlin Philharmonic playing an entire concert under Sir Simon Rattle in the empty Philharmonie concert hall in Berlin, which has happened more than once. It's about to happen again, in fact, under the new conductor, Kirill Petrenko. So the response is partly individual, partly institutional. Amongst the individuals, I could name probably the most outstanding in terms of sheer daily commitment to playing a concert every single day is the young German Russian-born pianist Igor Levit, who gives a concert every single day at 7 p.m. German time. Sometimes in extraordinarily august circumstances. One of his concerts was introduced verbally by the president of the German Federal Republic. A more recent concert was in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. So they're enormously high-profile events, some of them. I know of one cellist who, in a very entrepreneurial way, offered to record and send out greetings cards to one's loved ones. So I invested in a musical greetings card for my mother for Mother's Day in the UK. So there's an extraordinary variety of activity going on. And so that's very cheering. I have to say, not everybody approves of this. One German pop singer has said no to online concerts because they're free and they encourage people in the belief that music perhaps is naturally free and should always be afterwards. The question of how one comes out of the lockdown and how the performing arts reassemble themselves is a fascinating and very deep one. And I certainly don't want to gaze into a crystal ball, except to say one thing, which is that if the lockdown persists for some months more, which seems very likely, or almost certain, really, in some form, then when the musical world re-emerges into normality, I think some trace of the experience of lockdown will remain with it, and it will not simply be business as usual. I know, for example, that one promoter of concerts of young living composers in unusual spaces, this promoter is called Non-Classical, it's also a record label. The director of that organization, Gabriel Prokofiev, feels that it has been a learning experience, this lockdown. He has learned the value of filming concerts to a very high level from the filmic point of view. So they are, and it's leading him to think that when all this is over, he will continue that activity of concerts, not merely put online in a casual way, filmed on a computer's camera, instead filmed in a rather sophisticated way with 2 or 3 cameras and artistically edited afterwards, so that it becomes a total experience on as high a level visually as it is musically. So that's one, could possibly be one permanent result of the lockdown when it's over. And I think there will be others. I don't think it will be business as usual. My own life has been affected, pretty profoundly. I used to do review concerts a lot for the Daily Telegraph. There are none now, so I'm not doing that anymore, but I'm writing a lot for the paper in other ways. And so I, like all arts journalists, have had to think rather fast to imagine other ways in which we can communicate with our readers about our subject matter, given that it's not happening live anymore. I also teach quite a bit, and the teaching process online is something I've had to become used to rather quickly. I can't say it yet comes naturally to me, but it comes more naturally now than it did 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. So I am making progress. As for the future, I anticipate and maybe also hope that when live performance starts again, which I think will be a gradual process and rather tentative and could take a year or more to return to normal, but when it does start, that people will experience a great hunger for it, and they will realize the virtue of it, the peculiar, irreplaceable value of a close encounter with the performers, of course, up there on stage, but also with one's neighbor in the auditorium. These two things, I think, are the lifeblood of the arts, for which film things can never really be a substitute. They can be in a very interesting and useful creative adjunct, but they cannot be a substitute. And so I'm yearning for the day when I can once again attend a real live concert.